Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into what happens when political worlds collide. We are mapping out the absolutely chaotic, multi-topic showdown between JD Vance and the hosts of The View. We're going to frame this analysis by looking at both the actual transcript of the interview and the intense online reaction it sparked. Because let's be honest, when politicians step into hostile media environments, the results are rarely boring, and this sit-down, yeah, it was absolutely no exception.
Okay, let's set the stage by looking at the online framing first. Take this quote from commentator Clinton Jaws. They hyped this event up as a massive partisan battle, predicting the hosts were prepared to just completely dismantle Vance. And you know, this perfectly captures the intense anticipation and the deeply polarized lens through which this entire interview is viewed, literally before Vance even sat down at the table.
Now, talk show debates are notoriously scattershot, right? So to cut through all the noise, we're breaking this confrontation down into 5 distinct battlegrounds. 1. The economy. 2. Epstein transparency. 3. Border security. 4. Race and history. And finally, 5. The cat lady's comment.
All right, Section 1. Economy, inflation, and affordability. Who is to blame?
Look, right out of the gate, we get our first massive clash of narratives. The host comes in hot, aggressively pushing the idea that Donald Trump dismisses Americans' financial struggles as a complete hoax. She contrasts that alleged apathy with his lavish personal spending, pointing out things like ballrooms. But Vance, he sharply counters this by clarifying the context. He argues that Trump never actually said affordability itself was a hoax. Instead, he claims the real hoax is the media and the Democratic Party placing the blame for the affordability crisis squarely onto the GOP.
To defend the campaign, Vance goes straight on the offense, pointing directly at the Biden administration's record. And he zeroes in on one incredibly stark data point, 9%. That's the peak inflation rate. He uses this single number as a hammer to firmly place the blame for the country's initial economic turbulence right on the current administration's policies.
But, of course, the hosts push back on current conditions, prompting Vance to acknowledge the current inflation rate of 3.5%. He openly admits, hey, this number is still entirely too high for American families. However, he quickly pivots to a message of recovery. He argues that under a Trump-Vance vision, manufacturing and construction jobs will continue to increase to fix what he very distinctly calls an inherited mess.
Moving right along to Section 2, the Epstein transparency dispute, politics or principle.
This topic is fascinating because it brilliantly illustrates how two clashing realities can basically exist at the exact same table. When discussing the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files, the host frames Trump as this reluctant actor, claiming he only yielded to pressure from hard-right congresswomen like Lauren Boebert. But Vance paints a diametrically opposed picture. He portrays Trump as a willing, even eager participant who pushed to release the files because he was frustrated that Democrats were trying to weaponize the situation against him. According to Vance, Trump just wanted his name cleared.
To fight back against that heavy focus on their past friendship, Vance builds his defense around a very specific timeline. He says, okay, yes, in the 1980s they were known associates. But, Vance argues, a decade later, Trump kicked Epstein out of his club for his behavior. And then, the final, most crucial point Vance leans on is that Trump actually reported Epstein to the police. Vance uses this entire chronology to argue that Trump ultimately helped trigger Epstein's downfall, a detail he claims the media just intentionally ignores.
Okay, on to Section 3. Clashing over border security, morality versus enforcement.
This is where the debate pivots entirely away from the mechanics of policy and straight into some really heavy moral implications. The host executes this incredibly clever maneuver, basically using Vance's own words from 2016 against him. Fellow Christians, everyone is watching when we apologize for this man. She uses that quote to question how Vance, leaning on his faith, can support a ticket that has historically used dehumanizing words like vermin while simultaneously calling himself a Christian. I mean, it's a direct, pointed challenge to his personal integrity.
And then, she drives that moral argument home by citing a staggering number, 6,200. That is the number of children she notes are currently held in the Dilley Detention Center. She vividly describes the conditions there as subhuman, lacking basic medical care and clean water, and uses this to directly challenge the humanity of strictly enforced border policies.
So how does Vance feel this intense emotional appeal? Well, he shifts the framework.
First, he argues that law enforcement is just inherently difficult and messy, and that arrests often involve violent resistance. But here's his biggest strategic pivot. He shifts the moral blame entirely away from border enforcement officers and places it directly onto human smuggling cartels. He argues that open borders are exactly what actually allow tens of thousands of children to be trafficked in the first place.
The immigration clash really peaks with this dispute over the concept of imported crime, which totally mirrors the broader national debate we're seeing right now. The host insists there is zero evidence that Venezuelan leader Maduro emptied insane asylums. She calls it a dangerous, made-up narrative. Vance counters this by pointing to the funded caravans of 2022 and 2023, claiming that foreign governments absolutely encouraged criminals to head toward the U.S. border.
All right, let's look at Section 4, Debating Race and History, Erasure or Economics. Here, the host aggressively questions where people of color actually fit into the modern Republican vision, and she comes prepared with a severe list of grievances. Everything from the removal of civil rights information about Emmett Till in museums to the deliberate dismantling of specific black voter districts. For her, these represent literal ways black history and political power are being actively erased.
So, faced with these incredibly heavy cultural accusations directly to his face, how exactly does JD Vance respond? Well, instead of getting bogged down in a museum-by-museum debate, Vance asks for specifics. He insists that his party does indeed celebrate Black history, and then he executes a very calculated, hard pivot.
He attempts to reframe the racial discussion entirely. Vance points to Washington, D.C., noting it's a highly Democratic and predominantly black city. He highlights that when physical safety is prioritized, cities see radical decreases in violent crime, sexual assaults, and murder. Do you see what he's doing here? He's trying to shift the metrics of success for minority communities away from historical and cultural representation and purely toward physical safety and economic outcomes, a pivot that clearly frustrates the hosts who really wanted to stay on the topic of historical erasure.
Finally, Section 5, The Cat Lady's Conclusion, a Personal Mea Culpa.
Now, in what was honestly a surprisingly rare moment of agreement on this panel, Vance explicitly owns up to his highly publicized childless cat lady's remark. He actually admits that when his language just shuts people down, it's a failure of communication. He explicitly labels his own past words as boneheaded. It's this brief moment of vulnerability that actually seems to disarm the panel for a second. But make no mistake, Vance doesn't waste the apology. He uses that mea culpa to neatly transition right back into his core philosophical point. He argues that his clumsy phrasing was actually just trying to highlight a massive societal shift. His belief that society has become fundamentally anti-family and anti-child, making everyday things way more difficult. He wraps up the interview on this note, which surprisingly leads to a pretty cordial ending, where the hosts even gift him a baby onesie to celebrate his growing family.
Bringing us totally full circle, the YouTube commentator Clinton Jaws returns at the end of their video to declare Vance the undeniable victor of the exchange. Despite all the nuanced policy debates and those moments of mutual agreement we literally just walked through, the commentator claims the host simply crumbled. It's fascinating, right? It brilliantly illustrates the irony that no matter what data or policy is discussed on stage, the partisan lens of the viewer often remains firmly intact.
So as you digest all these claims, the counterclaims, and the strategic pivots we've explored today, I want to leave you with this final thought. When we watch these highly anticipated viral political clashes, are we actually learning about policy differences, or are these formats just designed to harden the partisan narratives we already hold? It is absolutely a crucial question to ask ourselves the next time an interview like this hits our feeds. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and hey, keep asking the hard questions.